Welcome everyone to the Atlas or training for the Santa Cruz County Breeding Bird Atlas 2. My name is Alex Rinkert. I'm the project director and I work for the Santa Cruz Bird Club, which is sponsoring the Breeding Bird Atlas. Today's training will start out with a little bit of background on what a Breeding Bird Atlas is and how they're used. And then we'll talk about the progress we've made through 2020 on our Breeding Bird Atlas. And next we'll get into the basics of atlasing, what it is, and then how to record your observations on a datasheet. Breeding Bird Atlas is a compendium of everything that's known about the breeding birds in a region. Often this region of interest is an entire state, but in California, many of the counties have their own breeding bird atlas. Breeding bird atlases are completed within a 5 to 7 year time frame. That's when the field work is conducted. And this serves as a snapshot within a much longer time frame of 20 to 30 years. That is used to compare generational changes in breeding bird populations. These breeding bird atlases are citizen science projects. They're powered almost entirely by volunteer birders, and they're primarily produced as books, but more recently some breeding bird atlases have been published as websites and in other electronic media. So breeding bird atlases contain the locations where the birds are breeding, and based on those exact locations, we can extrapolate to estimate the probability of each species breeding in certain areas. Breeding bird atlases also show when each bird is breeding, when it is nest building, when it has eggs or young in the nest, and when its young are still dependent on parental care during the fledgling stage. It also shows how many of each species are breeding and where, their abundance. And breeding bird atlases are a great place to describe a lot of the local natural history of a species, such as what types of nesting substrates does it use? Does the species nest on cliffs, on buildings, on trees, and what they make their nests out of? Breeding bird atlases are really an indispensable resource for conservation. They help us understand these long-term generational changes in breeding bird populations that may not otherwise be noticed in a much shorter study. And some examples of this are the brewer's blackbird, which has declined precipitously in Santa Cruz County over the past 20 to 30 years. Breeding bird atlases are important to natural resource management. They help tell us where the most breeding birds are and the most diversity is, as well as when is a best time to do vegetation management that will avoid any adverse impacts to certain breeding birds. Breeding bird atlases provide foundational information that is contributed to environmental impact reports and statements. And atlases also help contextualize your observations. Is what you saw unusually early or unusually late for that bird breeding? Or is it in an unusual location or on an unusual nesting substrate? So it helps to add a lot of context to what you're seeing. An example of the utility of Breeding Bird Atlas was demonstrated by a tree cutting proposal a few years ago at Quail Hollow Ranch. The county wanted to take down a large ponderosa pine at the ranch that served as an acorn woodpecker granary and a nesting site. And when we heard about these plans, we consulted Breeding Bird Atlas data, which showed that acorn woodpeckers are actually nesting into early August and early September, which is when the county was planning to cut down this tree. So we presented this information to the county, and they decided to postpone the cutting of this tree until after the acorn woodpeckers were done breeding to avoid any adverse impact that may have been inflicted on this breeding population here. So all the states and provinces in green on this map have their own breeding bird atlas, or even 2 or 3 breeding bird atlases. And in California, most of the counties on the coast have a breeding bird atlas, except for Del Norte, Mendocino, and Santa Cruz. In 1987 through 1993, fieldwork was actually conducted for a Santa Cruz County breeding bird atlas, and the fieldwork was completed, and a summary of the first half of this project was published in the Atlaser's Assistant 90. This Atlaser's Assistant has a lot of good narrative and maps and graphs of about 25% of the species breeding in Santa Cruz. But at this point, it's over 30 years out of date, and a lot has changed since then. And this is one of the reasons why the Santa Cruz Bird Club decided to sponsor the Santa Cruz County Breeding Bird Atlas 2, which intends to produce an updated breeding bird atlas for the county, and also to compare the current results of this project to that done in 1987 through 93. So fieldwork for this project began in 2017, and it's expected to continue through the end of this year into fall of 2021. And then at the end of this year, we'll begin the publication process, which hopefully will last about 1 or 2 years. And at that point, you can expect to have a breeding bird atlas available on Santa Cruz County. So here's where we are in that timeline, just at the end of the fieldwork period. So today's training will focus on atlasing and interpreting breeding behavior, and also recording those observations on a data sheet. Atlasing is essentially birding, but with much more of a focus on the breeding behavior of birds. So when most of us go birding, we identify the species and maybe count how many there are at a specific location. But atlasing takes that one step further by focusing on what the birds are actually doing, their behavior. There are 2 types of observations you can make for the breeding bird atlas. There is an atlasing observation, and that has 3 different criteria. The primary purpose needs to be birding. You need to spend at least 15 minutes birding, and you need to be traveling on foot. So most of your birding is probably already considered atlasing. If you make an observation and it doesn't meet any of those 3 criteria, then it's considered an incidental observation. So these incidental observations could be while you're walking through a parking lot, going to the store, or driving around town. Any observation that doesn't meet the 3 criteria of an atlasing observation can be considered incidental. And there's really no difference in the value between these 2 different observations. It's just a way for us to distinguish them when we're partitioning the data to do our analyses. The breeding codes are used to qualify the breeding behavior that you observe. Each breeding code pertains to a specific breeding behavior. These codes are used in every breeding bird atlas, and also you may be familiar with them through eBird, which uses a similar set of breeding codes. The breeding codes are organized into 3 categories: confirmed, probable, and possible. And the codes within each category are arranged in a hierarchy from the highest degree of certainty that a bird is breeding at that specific location to the lowest degree of certainty. So, for example, if you saw this hermit thrush nest in the upper right corner of the screen, that would be considered NY, nest with young, which is the highest breeding code that you can use. It means that we are absolutely certain that that hermit thrush is breeding right there, as opposed to the song sparrow in the lower right, which is just in suitable habitat. That's the lowest breeding code. And just because that song sparrow is in suitable habitat doesn't necessarily mean that it's breeding right there. So while you're atlasing, you'll want to focus almost entirely on the confirmed breeding codes. These codes are the most valuable to the project. And while you may see a lot of probable and possible evidence, and it's good to know how to describe those behaviors with the breeding codes, you should really be focusing on confirmed breeding behavior. So next, we're going to go through each of these confirmed breeding codes and discuss the definitions and some caveats to be aware of while you're atlasing. All right, so the first code we're going to talk about is NY, nest with young. This is when you find a nest that you can actually see the nestlings inside, or you can hear them baking from inside the nest. So if you walk by a nest box and you hear baking young inside, and you know which species is using the box, you can use this code to describe your observation, NY. Nest with eggs, NE, is when you can actually see the eggs inside the nest. If you can't see the eggs inside the nest, there's a different code for that, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Bird carrying a fecal sac is FS. Fecal sac is a circular gelatinous ball that contains the nestling's feces. And adults remove these fecal sacs from the nest to reduce the odor that may attract predators and also to maintain a sanitary nest environment. So you'll see adult birds, especially cavity nesters, removing fecal sacs almost immediately after they leave the cavity or nest. They'll drop the fecal sac while they're flying away. FY, feeding fledged young, is when you see a juvenile bird out of the nest being fed by an adult. This code should not be used when you see an adult feeding young that are still inside the nest. That counts as NY, not FY. Bird carrying food usually has multiple food items that it's holding in its bill. Usually the food you'll see birds carrying are worms or insects, but sometimes birds will carry small animals and fruit to their young. An occupied nest is one that has eggs or young, but you can't actually see the eggs or young inside. Their presence is inferred by the behavior of the adult. So a bird in incubation position, such as this Anna's hummingbird, could be considered an occupied nest. Using this code gets a little tricky, especially with cavity nesters, because in most circumstances, you can't actually see the eggs or young inside the nest. So there are a few things to consider when you encounter a cavity nesting bird visiting a possible nest site. How long is the bird staying inside the cavity? Is it bringing anything inside, or is it removing anything? And if you go back a week later or a few days later, is the bird exhibiting the same behaviors there? And it can also be informative to consult the literature on that species, such as Birds of the World produced by the Cornell Lab, to see what exactly the breeding behaviors are for the species and how you may be able to tell if the cavity actually has eggs or young inside based on the bird's behavior. FL, recently fledged young, is a very common code used in June and July when there are a lot of fledglings around. And the main thing to know about this code is that the young bird must exhibit some type of dependency on the parent for either food or protection. Some common signs of dependency include begging and quivering wings and following the adult around. But also if the bird has any remnant down, if it may have left the nest a little too early, that also counts as a sign of dependency. Bright and swollen gape is a good clue to look for other signs of dependency on a bird that's recently fledged. And again, the key to using this code is that the bird must have exhibited some type of dependency, whether that be begging, remnant down, or quivering wings and following the adult around. Later in the season, in July and August, you may see a lot of juvenile birds that are more or less independent, and those don't get assigned this breeding code. They're already dependent and beyond the point when we track the breeding behaviors. There are two different developmental pathways for birds. With the FL, recently fledged young code we just talked about, that mostly pertains to altricial species, which are those that hatch in the nest and are generally helpless for a period of time. Then they fledge the nest and are still dependent to some extent on their parents. Precocial species, on the other hand, hatch in the nest and then leave very soon after and are more or less independent from parental care. These precocial species include waterfowl, game birds such as quail and turkey, shorebirds, rails, which includes American coot, and grebes. Those are the precocial groups of species we have in this area. So when a precocial species hatches and leaves the nest, they're completely downy and tiny for a period of time. And we classify those birds as PY, precocial young. When they grow a little more, they're more intermediate in size, and some of the down is replaced by feathers. Then we classify those individuals as FL, recently fledged young. So most of the dependent young you'll see while atlasing are altricial species, and you'll use the FL code for those. But for precocial species, you may use either PY or FL, depending on how old the young are. Here are some precocial young common gallinules. They're both tiny and completely downy still at this stage. A use nest is one that is not apparently in use by a bird at the time. And it's important to be very careful with identifying the species that built the nest, because a lot of birds, especially open cup nesters, build a very similar nest that may or may not be distinguishable from other species. However, some bird nests can be distinguished, such as these American robin nests, which are a mud cup lined with grass and other soft material inside. Another nest that you may encounter in this area that is pretty easy to identify is the bush tit nest, which is a long pendulous stalk that hangs from the tree. Distraction display is the behavior by an adult that is intended to lure predators away from nest or young. The adults feign an injury, such as a broken wing, and kind of drag their wings and tail on the ground to try and lure that predator or you away from their nest or young. The most famous example of this around here is the killdeer. But some land birds also do distraction displays, like this common yellowthroat. It's flopping its wings, dragging its tail on the ground, trying to lure a predator away. Physiological evidence is a brood patch, which is used to keep eggs and nestlings warm, and also clavicle protuberance. These two types of physiological evidence can only be seen by licensed bird banders, which are allowed to hold birds in the hand and examine them for these signs of physiological evidence. And because of that, most of us won't be using this code, but it's still worth knowing about. Nest building, NB, is when you see a bird nest building at the actual site. And if you only see a bird carrying nest material, use the code CN carrying nest material. So most of the observations you make will be pretty neatly classified into one breeding code. But sometimes you may observe a bird long enough to see one or even two or three different breeding codes that could describe your observation. And the key here is to always choose the highest breeding code on the list that describes your observation. So this American robin has a nest with young, and it's also carrying food, but we'll choose to record NY nest with young because it's higher than CF carrying food. Here's another example of observation that could be described by two different breeding codes. This western bluebird nest has both nestlings and eggs, but we'll choose to record this observation as NY instead of NE because NY nest with young is higher than the other code on the list. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about how to actually record these observations on a data sheet. All the atlasing materials you'll need can be downloaded from the Santa Cruz Bird Club website. The materials that you'll be using the most are the Atlas datasheet and the Atlas map. There are a number of other resources that I encourage you to check out, such as the full definitions of the breeding codes and more examples of precocial and fledged young. So on your datasheet, you will record every single breeding confirmation you find, even if it's the same bird exhibiting the same behavior at the same location. As long as those observations are on different days, it's okay to record duplicate conformations of the same bird on your data sheet. These orange dots represent all the locations of the breeding conformations we've collected since 2017. And I should say that even if you only submit one breeding conformation to the project, we can get so much information out of just one observation. In addition to contributing to the maps and our phenology graphics, we can get information from that observation that includes vegetation type, elevation, slope and aspect, the distance from a stream or reservoir, and the burn severity of the habitat, and so much more about that observation that will help us better understand the breeding habitats that each species uses. So you'll only have one data sheet for the entire season, and you'll continue to add observations to that data sheet over time. The observations don't need to be in any specific order. They don't need to be in chronological or alphabetical order. Just add them as you go. And at the end of the season in August, you'll submit your data sheet via email to me. So I'm going to pull up the Atlas data sheet and the Atlas map, which is on the right. And we're going to practice recording a few observations on the data sheet. So the Atlas map on the right contains a grid system of 72 equally sized blocks. And that is the Atlas project area. Each one of these blocks is about 9 square miles. And each block has a unique number identifier. So clicking on one of the black and white squares on these blocks results in the block number in this upper left being displayed. So each one of your observations will need to be assigned a block number so we know where that observation came from. So moving over to the data sheet on the left, the data sheet is an Excel spreadsheet, and you'll start at the first tab, the Overview tab. You'll write your name in the Observer field. And then you'll move on to the next tab, the Effort tab, if you're recording an Atlasine observation. You'll record the date of the observation, the block number. Let's say we were in Santa Cruz on the San Lorenzo River, and that block is 8590, and we figured that out by clicking on this little black and white square in the middle of the block. Then we'll record the number of hours we spent atlasing in that block on that date, and the number of observers for this observation. Next, we'll move on to the Breeding Records tab, and we'll record some of the same information as on the Effort tab. So the date and the block number, 8590. We'll then choose a record type. So this is either an atlasine or incidental observation. We recorded information on the Effort tab. So this is an atlasine observation. For an incidental observation, you can skip the effort tab and go straight to the breeding records tab, which is where you record all your observations. So we'll choose atlasine, and then we'll type in the species name or the 4-letter code. And then we'll choose the breeding code, the highest breeding code that describes our observation. So let's just say we saw an American robin nest with young. And then we'll choose coordinates for that observation location. So how to do that is through Google Maps, zoom in on the exact location of where that observation was. And what you'll do is hover your mouse over that location, right click, and a drop-down menu appears with coordinates at the top of the list. You'll click on the coordinates, which are then copied to your clipboard, go over to the datasheet, right click, and paste in that cell. And it's as simple as that. That's how to record an observation for the Breeding Bird Atlas. There are a few other things that we'll cover. Scrolling right for the same observation, you can record a few notes that are pertinent to the observation, such as where the nest was, with how high it was off the ground, something like this. And moving further right on the datasheet, there's a column that says county, and each observation defaults to being in Santa Cruz County. However, because the blocks cross the county line and include some of Monterey, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and San Benito County, you may not always be in Santa Cruz County if you're in an Atlas block. So just make sure if you find yourself in another county, but still inside one of these Atlas blocks, that you change the county to be where you were. The next two columns are a way of making sure your data is accurately entered into the spreadsheet. The first one says, did you enter an effort? And if it's green and says yes, that means the date and the block on the breeding records tab matches the same date and block that you entered on the effort tab. These two pieces of information need to match on both the effort and breeding records tab for the data sheet to accept it. If we change either the block or the date for this observation, so there's a mismatch between the effort and breeding records information, and we scroll right, we'll see that the data sheet says that the effort data on the effort tab does not match that which is on the breeding records tab. So the data sheet will warn you that those two pieces of information are mismatched. And similarly, the coordinates we entered are not in that block that they fall into. So the coordinates that you record for an observation need to be somewhere inside the block that you recorded. And if we change this block back to 8590, which is where the coordinates were, we'll see that the data sheet says everything is okay. You'll see a green yes. So again, if you're recording an incidental observation, skip this effort tab. There's no need to record any effort for an incidental observation. Just go straight to the breeding records tab and record the date, the block, and make sure to choose incidental. You can use the 4-letter species codes if you want, and coordinates. So right-click, click on the coordinates at the top, and then paste them into the datasheet. And you'll see that there's no red warning that says there's information mismatch. So you may go atlasing early in the season or late in the season and not see any confirmations while you're atlasing. That's okay. Just make sure to record your effort on the effort tab. Like that. No need to record any observations on the breeding records tab if you didn't find any confirmations. So that's the basics of atlasing and recording observations. I'm happy to take any questions at this point.